You're listening to the Marne Report.
Howdy, Fort Stewart Hunter Army Airfield. It's Brian Lund here with another edition of the Marne Report podcast. And today we got a special guest. We have another Brian in the building. Yes, we have Brian Greer, our post archaeologist. How you doing today?
I'm doing just fine. How about you?
I'm doing great. Well, it's great to have you. Before we hop into all the fun stuff we have to talk about, can you first tell me what does it mean to be a post archaeologist? What does that look like for you?
Every day is quite different. Being an archaeologist on a federal installation like this, first of all, the reason why we have an archaeologist on staff is because under the National Historic Preservation Act, we're required to take into account all of our activities and undertakings that might have an impact to any of the cultural resources, which are anything from the historic cemeteries, the archaeological sites, and the historic buildings. And so as a federal agency, we're required to evaluate whether or not our Army's mission is going to have an impact to any of the cultural resources. So as an archaeologist, my job here is to review the different types of projects that are here. And of those projects that we have going on all across the installation here in the Cantonment area, both here at Fort Stewart and at Hunter Army Airfield. And so a lot of times we're reviewing those projects on a day-to-day basis. But we also have to do some field work to do some investigations and excavations of archaeological sites in areas that haven't been inventoried or surveyed previously. And what we're looking for is any past human activity. So any archaeological sites from the old home sites that used to be out here prior to Fort Stewart being acquired by the Army. So we had numerous communities that were here prior to 1940, dating all the way back to 1730s with the first colonial era fort that was established here on the installation right when Oglethorpe established Savannah. About 9 months afterwards, they established Fort Argyle, so it's one of the earliest colonial period sites here in Georgia, and it's right here on Fort Stewart. And of course, all of the archaeological sites that are related to the Native American sites dating back to roughly 12,000 years ago. We've had human occupation sites that are related to the archaeological record of the Native Americans that were hunting here and living here.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. We have a lot of cool lore that surrounds our Fort Stewart Hunter Army Airfield bases. And what I want to specifically talk about is our cemeteries today. So before we get into our cemetery tours and why our cemeteries are so important in this area, can you kind of paint the picture of why is this something that we essentially dig into? How did we get here? What did that look like before?
So imagine yourself 1940s. If you go right off post here and look at some of the old homes that are right off the installation boundaries, you'll see a lot of the homes from the early 1900s on up through 1940s era. So that would have been here. There would have been dozens of communities that lived here on Fort Stewart. So when the Army came in and decided to build a anti-aircraft artillery range, they displaced probably a good 3,000 individuals and families from this land. And so as part of that, the cemeteries where everybody lived, the communities that were supported, the people had their cemeteries associated with either their churches or the communities. And when the government acquired the properties, they did not move the cemeteries. They left them all in place. And what they did is they told the residents that were being vacated that they would have access to these cemeteries for the future. And so fast forward all the way up to about 1992, there was a greater interest that was starting to surround the historic cemeteries here. And at that time, Major General Blackwell in 1992 formed the Fort Stewart Cemetery Council. That was the very first time that they had a actual council and a meeting where they invited members of the communities, the descendant communities, and they met and talked about the different issues surrounding the cemeteries and access to the cemeteries. But then they also went on a tour of the cemeteries as well. So ever since then, we've had cemetery tours every fall and every spring, and we go and visit usually 4, 6, 7 different cemeteries. Quite often get into areas that are very difficult to get into because of all the training that may occur. Some of these cemeteries are actually downrange of some of these active live fire areas. So take those opportunities to be able to see several of the cemeteries all at once. And then also the most important part is to have that connection by the families, because this is the only visual reminders that the former residents and their descendants have of what Fort Stewart made of, what it looked like during the 1940s, because none of the buildings survived, with the exception of one historic building left on post. So the cemeteries are the the visual reminders that connect families of all the people that gave up their land so the Army could have a training facility.
Yes, sir. And so, from your perspective in all your historical research, what did life kind of look like back then in the 1940s? Do we have kind of a picture of how it was occupied back then?
So in the 1940s, let's say maybe 1930s, as we're just approaching when the Army takes over the properties. So it looked like just your standard, very rural communities, but there were also towns that were here. There was actually a county seat. The county seat for Bryan County was actually in what was called Clyde, and Clyde was the county seat up until 1933. It had an old wooden courthouse, and it had a brick jail, and it had churches, Masonic lodge. It had an established infrastructure just like any other small towns and communities. And so at that time, in 1933, unbeknownst to the residents, they had no idea that the Army would be coming in, but they ended up moving the county seat to Pembroke. And so at that point, Clyde was still a town, still pretty small, but it had been the courthouse and the county seat for Bryan County since the early 1800s. There were several other communities that sprung up usually right around the 1900s, early 1900s. There was a railroad that crossed the entire installation, starting from the north central part and then going all the way over to Glenville. And several communities popped up during that period of time between the 1900s and 1920s. The railroad ended up being dismantled in 1923. Railroads were becoming less important at that point in time because essentially the automobile was starting to really become a lot more affordable. And so people were relying on those for transportation a lot more, for not only for people, but also for just goods and products. So essentially this was a large farming community, but there were several towns that had several doctors. Taylor's Creek is a good example. They had several doctors that lived in that town, several churches, numerous churches, and their cemeteries, associated cemeteries, lots of schools. Probably would have been, in most cases, the standard wooden one-room schoolhouse, but there were also larger brick schoolhouses, for example, at the town of Willie, and then also at Taylor's Creek. So there are some established communities out here.
Yeah, and so what were kind of the significant families that were in the area? What were some of the big names around the area then?
So if you look at essentially the settlement patterns of how Fort Stewart was established, or the lands that would become Fort Stewart were settled. So first of all, it would have been the eastern side of the installation along the Ogeechee River. So rivers played a very important part early on. The Fort Argyle community and fort itself was established in 1734, and it had families that were living there along with the Rangers, the soldiers that were stationed there. And then about 1760s, the Taylor's brothers moved westward, inward towards the interior of Fort Stewart, about where 119 leaves the cantonment area, right there at Taylor's Creek, the actual Taylor's Creek, hence its name. And so that general area was settled by the Taylor's brothers in 1760s. And then we start to see a migration of a lot of the people that lived in South Carolina and portions of North Carolina that were moving down into this area of Georgia, and then quickly moved westward through the late 1700s and on up to the western side of the installation. And we get a community called Long Branch, which was an early 1800s era Long Branch. It was centered around the Moody family. They had a Dr. Moody that lived up there. And it was an important transportation hub as well, because the river ran through, Comanche River ran right through that town there. But then starting from about 1800s through on up to about the Civil War, it was essentially your standard farming communities. But then the importance of the turpentine industry, or the naval stores industry is also called, it would dominate the southeastern coastal plain of Georgia for almost up until the 1930s and up until the 1940s. And turpentine industry was extremely important in this area because of all the pine trees. Just about every pine tree out here was tapped for the gum, or the pine gum, which was then boiled down and distilled into turpentine and rosin, and it was used for a variety of different industrial purposes. And that industry was second to the cotton industry. So cotton, very important historically, but then the turpentine industry was a very important industry in this part of this part of the coastal plain.
And let's talk cemetery tour a little bit more, because I've joined you on some of these tours and they're really fun, really interesting. What do you believe is your favorite part about hosting these tours?
The most important part is really listening to the stories that the families, or even in some cases the actual residents, the former residents, they're getting up there in age, of course. So those former residents are fewer and far between these days, but they are passing on those stories about their life, what it was like here in the 1930s, 1920s, even some cases. And so all this information is getting passed down, and it's an opportunity for essentially the different generations to connect to where their family grew up, because many of the families didn't move very far from this area here. So a lot of families are related to each other in one form or fashion. So there's a lot of interconnectedness of community.
Yeah, for sure. And through your time and going through all these tours, what is one of your favorite stories that you've heard from people that have come on tour?
That's a good question. I think probably some of my favorite stories are some of the stories I heard about some of the folks living in the Taylor's Creek community, and they were talking about basically getting scared at night. So just as kids trying to walk around at night and going from place to place, and they were just as scared as we are today of the things that go bump in the night. So many different stories about just growing up and just kind of the same types of, I guess, childhood memories and fears that you would have. So that kind of sticks out in my mind. But generally speaking, a lot of the same stories are very similar stories are being told. A lot of it has to do with and being centered around the churches, typically because the cemeteries are usually going to be related to a central church, which would then be part of a community, but not always. And so there's a lot of discussion about how that church operated, and then a lot of times there's stories about how the former residents, how their courtship was centered around that community as well. And so there's lots of stories about being young teenagers and young adults and talking about their courtship, which is obviously quite different than it is today, but nonetheless, it's still very, very interesting stories.
Yes, sir. And as you go through some of these tours, you'll come across a cemetery that has a bunch of headstones, or then you'll come across that might just have one or two. Mm-hmm. What does that essentially look like? Was there more importance for a specific last name, or kind of how does the displacement kind of work for those cemeteries?
So a lot of times what you'll find is just a handful of cemeteries. So the average cemetery would be a family cemetery, someone that might have been buried on their own property, and then over time families and the extended families would then start to bury in that same area. And then maybe over time a church moves in close to that area, and so then the church becomes part of that cemetery. So a lot of times it's just simply a family cemetery, or it can be sometimes just a single headstone that's out there, and depending on when they were deceased, say for example if it was in the 1930s, shortly thereafter government comes in, and of course they're not living in the area, so they're not burying there at that time. However, the other issue too is that a lot of times the headstones, especially as you go farther back in time, the headstones were going to be of a non-permanent nature. So, for example, wooden markers, headstone markers. And so a lot of those have disappeared just over time. We have a handful of wooden markers that still remain. But for the most part, they were getting their headstones probably shipped in from Savannah. Of course, there's no quarries here locally, so they were shipping it from either North Georgia down into Savannah, and then being sold to the residents in this area here. And during the early 1900s, through about the 1920s, I think, actually the Sears catalog would have actually sold headstones. That would have been another opportunity to get a mail order headstone.
Yeah, and so I'm going to throw you a little curveball here as we kind of wrap up this podcast. Just for our viewers and dropping a little historical fact, what do you believe is one of the coolest things that you've learned about the Fort Stewart Hunt Armory area that people may not know?
I would say it's probably going to be the Fort Argyle site. It is a very important colonial era site, British fort that was established about 9 months after Savannah, and it didn't really see much of any kind of military action, but it was an important trading center also for the sparse population of Native Americans that traveled to this area. So there was quite a bit of trade that was coming in on the western end of essentially the city limits. And so over time, the fort would be occupied, be out there with their families, and they would leave the fort for a while, for a few years, and they'd come back and they'd have to repair it. So they ended up building a succession of a variety of different forts that were built out there. And so it ended up changing over time. So we can see the evolution of the fort, archaeologically speaking. There's nothing that's above ground anymore, but we can find out a lot of information about how people lived on essentially the frontier of the colony of Savannah at that point. And it was occupied from 1734 through about right up until close to the Revolutionary War. But then also in that area, close by to there was the former lands of Governor Wright, who was the Georgia governor at that point during the Revolutionary War. So he had some old rice fields that were on the installation. Part of his properties were here on Fort Stewart. Also, Native American villages. There was at least 2 Native American villages that were here prior to the colonial settlement of this area here. And so just a wide variety of history, ranging from even some Spanish influence and contact from the coast, from the Spanish missions that settled along the Georgia coast and the Barrier Islands. Of course, the English that had settled here, and then over time, you just get a very diverse communities that were out here.
We do have a cemetery tour coming up soon. Can you give a little bit of insight of maybe some of the stops that we're going and a little bit of the history that we're going to be talking about then?
Sure. I believe that we have 4 cemeteries that we're going to be visiting on this tour. The first one's going to be Corinth Cemetery, and it is a late 1800s, early 1900s community. It would have been essentially the outlying community of maybe the larger town of Clyde, but Corinth had its own church there. But it also had a rail stop that came off of what was called the Teuton Railroad, or the Savannah and Southern Railroad, and it had stopped at Corinth. And at one point in time, it was conjectured that they were going to actually extend that that railroad all the way from Corinth over to Clyde, which would have been a large town, and then all the way over to the Ogeechee River, and then also meet up with the Ogeechee Canal. So it would have been an important railroad hub. But at that point, like I said earlier, the railroads were becoming less and less important. And so we'll be visiting there. A little bit different cemetery than some of the ones that we normally visit. It does have berms around it because it is downrange from some of the live fire areas. And then also we're going to be visiting Green Bay, again, another late 1800s, early 1900s era cemetery. It's fairly large, and so we'll be visiting that one. And then Irene Driggers is a cemetery that we haven't been to in quite a while. We'll be visiting there. And the names of these cemeteries, that was one thing I wanted to mention too, is that sometimes the cemetery names are just the names of the landowners that had owned that property at that time when the government acquired it. So all those years ago, no name for the cemetery, and so they would just name it whatever the name of the landowner was. So Irene Driggers is named after the landowner from 1940s. And then we're also going to be making a stop at Parker Sapp Cemetery. It's a very small cemetery there, but there was a home site that was there, so it was probably just a small family cemetery. And then wrapping up after that, lunch, and then a stop at the Fort Stewart Museum as well.
Yes, sir. And to our audience, I don't know if they realize, but yeah, this area just has so much rich history, and so these cemetery tours provide an insight and connects you with the community and some of the people still living that have these stories. So I believe that's one of the most fun things about these. So I encourage, if you have a chance and you're listening, come join us on this cemetery tour. They're always good times. You always are going to learn something new. And I think that's the most cool thing about it. But that's all we have time for today. I want to say thank you again for coming on our podcast.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, and enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, that's going to be it for today. Thank you to our listeners, and we'll see you again next week.
The My Army Post app is your one-stop source for all things Fort Stewart, Hunter Army Airfield. With map at your fingertips, you'll never miss out on upcoming events, installation updates, facility and gate information, weather, shopping, and so much more. My Army Post is free from your phone's app store. Download today.